Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to our two-part series entitled The Tale of 7 Years in a Box. This is the second part of a two-part series discussing the 1977 kidnapping and more than 7-year captivity of 20-year-old Colleen Stan in Red Bluff, California. If you have not listened to part 1, which is episode 154, pause this here, listen to that first, and then come back. Before we delve back into the story, I'd like to give thanks to a few more patrons for their support. I want to say thank you to Roseanne R., Krista M., Mandy K., Angel J., Samantha R., Angela H., Anna W., Therese W., Jill L., Sierra V., Miley G., Laura F., and Kat G. for joining or rejoining Patreon, and Sarah S., Deshawn S., and Barbara C. for raising their pledges to the next level. Now, if for some reason you missed your thank you or I missed your thank you, which is possible, please send me a direct message either to my email at californiapod@gmail.com. That's all lowercase KILLAFORNIAPOD @gmail, or send me a private message through Patreon or Facebook Messenger, and I'll make sure to give you a thank you on an upcoming episode. Because as of late Thursday morning, that's today, August 6th, I am officially caught up on the patron thank yous, finally. Also, I need to remind you listening of the warning that I provided in part 1. This episode contains details involving sexual assault, mental, physical, and sexual abuse, as well as sexually explicit language. This material is not suitable for young listeners or possibly for those who find the subject matter of this criminal case triggering. Listener discretion is strongly advised. In part 1, we left off at the point where Colleen Stan was taken into captivity by Cameron Hooker, who was accompanied by his wife, Janice. Janice's culpability in this case is debatable. I am right now not exactly sure where I stand with it yet. I'm hoping that we can hash it out together when we have a chance to discuss this when we are done listening. So let's get on with the final part of this nightmare that was Colleen Stan's new existence as a captive. Cameron Hooker had been a lumber mill worker by trade, which may explain somewhat as to why he had been able to build his various boxes and contraptions out of wood. He had attained that skill set. As for Janice, well, when she met Cameron in 1973, she was only 15 years old, 5 years younger than Cameron, 2 years younger than Colleen. She was a young lady with a very, very low self-esteem. She suffered from epilepsy, and she had a very sheltered existence and upbringing. Her parents were very strict, with lots of rules about what she could wear. She was not allowed to show off too much skin. She could not wear things that exposed her legs. If she went swimming or to the beach or to the lake, she was not allowed to wear a bathing suit that was too revealing, and dating was out of the question. When Janice met Cameron, he quickly zeroed in on the fact that she was young and insecure and naive, someone that he could easily manipulate and take advantage of. The interesting thing about Cameron is that he was generally a forgettable individual. He did not leave an indelible impression. He was very quiet and he kept to himself. So when he met Janice and was interested in dating her, she told him, "You're going to have to clear it with my parents." And it was likely the unassuming and unremarkable and largely forgettable personality of Cameron's that caused Janice's parents to let their guard down and allow her to go out on a date with him. And this would be her very first date ever. And before that date was over, Cameron was somehow able to convince Janet to play out some of his fantasies with him, which included her taking off her clothes and allowing him to bind her and hang her by her wrists from a tree, identical to the manner in which he had done to Colleen in his basement. And like Colleen, this caused Janice to experience a tremendous amount of pain. And therein lies what is at the heart of Cameron Hooker's motivation. He is what professionals and psychologists would describe as a sexual sadist, or having sexual sadist disorder. Sadistic personality disorder was introduced in the American Psychiatric Association's Manual of Mental Disorders in 1987, and sexual sadism falls under the umbrella of psychiatric disorders that are characterized by paraphilia, which, according to Psychology Today, is the experiencing of intense sexual arousal to atypical objects, situations, fantasies, urges, or behaviors. But it is only considered a disorder if the urges are acted upon that may cause or potentially cause harm or distress to oneself or others, and particularly to others when consent is not given. Sexual sadism is wanting or needing to be sexually aroused or gratified by inflicting pain, humiliation, fear, or some form of harm to a person by way of restraining a person with bindings like ropes, chains, handcuffs, holding someone captive, biting, whipping, or beating a person. In order to be diagnosed as a sadist, a person must engage in these activities with the person and have caused them distress or harm with or without their consent to these activities repeatedly, meaning more than once and at least 3 times. Cameron Hooker is described by experts as being a sexual sadist. He inflicted pain upon Janice at first, and then Colleen, and he did it in order to achieve sexual gratification. Despite the fact the way Cameron was treating Janice, he was causing her a great deal of pain and humiliation, there is a strong desire on her part to have that attention and this love that she thinks that she's getting from Cameron in return. Janice had never been in a relationship prior to meeting Cameron, so she really had nothing to compare this to. It was the first time her parents had given their blessings to allow her to date someone, and she didn't want to lose that either, so she went along with what Cameron wanted to do. And Cameron was able to give her enough love and affection in a manipulative way in order to be able to continue to do these things to Janice. It has been suggested that because Janice had no other framework or standard of comparison, that she assumed that this was what having sex was. And Cameron's ultimate goal was to have Janice as his sex slave for the long term. The couple were married in Reno, Nevada on January 18, 1975, 1 year and 4 months before they would kidnap Colleen Stan. After they were married, Cameron stepped up his abuse and sadistic behavior to another level. He wanted a slave, and the marriage to Janice all but guaranteed it for him. Just like many things in life that give people a rush or a high or a level of gratification, people need to intensify what it is they're doing in order to continue to achieve the same feelings of satisfaction. I am not an expert on this stuff at all, but I imagine it's like developing a tolerance. In Cameron's case, he's developing a tolerance to things that arouse him, and he keeps having to escalate in order to achieve the same levels of stimulation from his sadistic acts. So the amount of cruelty and pain that he inflicted upon Janice needed to increase and intensify to a point where she simply couldn't continue taking part in Cameron's fantasies. And in addition to that, Janice wanted to start a family, and she wanted to have children. She simply could not continue with the physical pain that her husband was subjecting her to if she wanted to get pregnant. So she needed to come up with some sort of compromise where they could both get what they wanted. After, I guess, a period of negotiation, the couple reached a deal. If Cameron can find someone to kidnap and hold captive to be his personal sex slave in place of Janice, then she could have a baby. That way, Cameron could participate in all of his sexually sadistic behaviors, as Janet had been fulfilling that impulse in him for several years by then. But there was a caveat. Janice insisted that Cameron was not to have any kind of sexual intercourse, no type of sexual penetration with the slave, only with her. Everything else was okay, except for sex. Of course, this wouldn't last, but it did, at least for a while. I'm gonna assume that for most of us, if not all of us, this all sounds like a really bizarre thing for Janice to agree to. It's very unusual. And I don't know how much power Janice had in the marriage. I mean, she seemed to have a measure of say-so, seeing as when she started wanting to have children, she did get what she asked for, though she would have to be okay with Cameron kidnapping and holding another woman captive. And he did agree to not have sexual intercourse with whomever they were holding captive, and I believe he stuck to the deal for some time, but he did eventually begin raping Colleen, which I will talk about more later on. So in a weird way, I guess Janice had a bit of leverage. But when you step back and look at the agreement that they came to, the fact that she agreed to Cameron kidnapping and torturing a young woman and holding her captive in their basement and under their bed, that isn't normal. Janice wanting to have a baby is a normal thing for a person to want. So that in and of itself makes this so-called compromise very lopsided, and frankly, it makes me cringe. Cameron would have probably done anything Janice wanted so long as he was able to have his slave. And for Janice, it is likely she was relieved to not have to be subjected to Cameron's bondage and torture anymore. And you will come to find that Janice does benefit handsomely with Colleen's presence in the home. While Colleen was living in Eugene, Oregon, she lived with roommates. After about a week had passed since they had all last seen her, they became concerned as they expected her to be back by then from her trip to visit her friend in California. So they went ahead and reached out to her parents to let them know that they had not heard from their daughter in about a week. Her parents, who lived all the way down in Riverside in Southern California, got the news from the concerned roommates. So they first decided to head up to where Colleen lived in Eugene to try and figure out what happened. So they made that drive, more than 900 miles or 1,450 kilometers. From there, they reported Colleen missing not only with the local law enforcement in Eugene, but also at numerous agencies along the route from Northern California headed north towards where Colleen resided. But there had been no sign of Colleen. It was as if she had just vanished into thin air. What her parents could not have imagined were the horrifying things that Colleen was being subjected to by Cameron Hooker. For the rest of 1977, so for the next 6 or 7 months, Colleen was kept locked inside that coffin-like box for at least 23 hours every single day. She was kept completely naked, hidden away underneath the hooker's bed. And day in and day out, the one thing that Colleen could see from where she was situated in that box was a photograph propped up nearby of a young woman who she later came to know was Marie Elizabeth Spenake. Let's pause Colleen's story here for a moment and talk about Marie Elizabeth. Marie Elizabeth was born June 20th, 1956. On January 31st, 1976, when she was 19 years old, she went missing from the city of Chico, California, which is a little more than 40 miles or 65 kilometers south of Red Bluff. She had just moved to Chico, where she lived with her boyfriend a couple of months earlier in 1975 from Cleveland, Ohio. Marie Elizabeth worked part-time as a model at a camera shop, and she was last seen around 4 p.m. on the afternoon of January 31st. While there is no definitive proof that could tie the hookers to Marie Elizabeth's disappearance and presumed death, authorities do strongly believe that the couple is responsible for it. Because, well, some years after the fact, Janice Hooker told police that they were. Some years after Colleen's abduction, Janice admitted to investigators that she and Cameron had been driving around when they noticed a young woman walking down the street. Sometime later, while looking through the woman's belongings, Janice learned that the woman's name was Marie Elizabeth Spanak, according to an ID card that she had with her when they picked her up. Once Elizabeth was in the car with them, they took her to their home and held her captive for 1 day. Cameron did what he did to both Janice and Colleen. He hung Elizabeth by her wrists from the rafters in his basement, but instead of torturing her and whipping her, he shot her in the abdominal area with a pellet gun, and then he strangled her. Janice went with Cameron to a nearby park where they buried the body. 1 year and 4 months later, Cameron and Janice kidnapped Colleen, and her captivity would last much, much longer than Elizabeth's. Marie Elizabeth has not been seen or heard from since the day she vanished, nor has her body or her remains ever been found. So back to Colleen. According to her recollection of the beginning of her captivity, for about the first 3 to 5 months, she was never let out of the basement of the hooker's home. There hadn't even been a slim chance that Colleen could see that she could attempt to escape captivity at all. There was never a moment when she was momentarily freed or left alone or Cameron wasn't paying attention where she could try to make a run for it. Before long, a routine began to develop. Colleen was kept down in the basement all day, locked in that box. At some point in the evening, Cameron would come down to the basement. He would give Colleen a portion of food and water. There was one occasion early on in Colleen's captivity where Cameron had provided her with some food, but she was unable to finish eating it. This caused him to become very angry, so as a punishment, more punishment than I guess she'd already been given, he hung her from the rafters and whipped her. Now that I think about it, that doesn't really sound much like a punishment because he does that anyway. But she eventually finished her meal, at which point he locked her back inside the box. Cameron would allow Colleen to go to the bathroom in a bedpan. And once the meals were finished and she was finished going to the bathroom, Cameron would then hang Colleen once again from the rafters, whip her, and then put her back in the box until the next night. When she was out of the box, Colleen was never alone. She even had to go to the bathroom in front of him. This was Cameron's way of controlling every single aspect of Colleen's existence. Controlling when she's able to get up, stand up, eat, drink, relieve herself, and get back in the box. And in keeping her isolated in the manner in which he was for him was essential to getting Colleen feeling that she had no choice but to be dependent on him, that he and only he is essential for her survival. She would eventually begin to feel like she needs him or else she's going to die. And it is also important that Colleen is not speaking to or seeing anyone else or having anyone trying to explain to her or fill her mind with things that Cameron doesn't want Colleen to know about or think of. He's controlling what she hears and sees and thinks on top of everything else. It was revealed in court documents that for the first 5 months that Colleen was in captivity that she was naked, chained, and forced to wear the box on her head constantly. Cameron pretty much on a daily basis practiced bondage on Colleen, and in addition to hanging her from the rafters, he used various techniques to restrict her ability to breathe. He used electrical cords to shock her. He burned her genital area with a heat lamp. He dunked her head in water for extended periods of time. Colleen estimated that she was whipped about 100 times during her first 6 months in captivity, which comes to about once every other day. In January of 1978, about 8 months or so after being kidnapped, things changed for Colleen somewhat. Cameron drew up a contract based on a sample contract that he saw in some S&M bondage magazine that he subscribed to. It was described as an underground magazine. It was a master-slave contract that he demanded Colleen to sign, which was a lifelong contract. At first, Colleen resisted signing it. But Cameron told her that a representative from what he called the company was going to come by and make sure that she complied. And I will explain what he told her the company was in just a moment. But when he told her this, she went ahead and signed it out of fear. And when she did, she broke down in tears. Colleen was signing on to be Cameron Hooker's slave for the rest of her life. And it seemed as though Colleen felt the contract was binding, that it was legitimate, and that now that she signed it, she was going to have to abide by the contract forever. She was signing over her mind, body, and soul. He owned her, and she was forbidden from saying no to him. She was to call him master. She was to call Janice ma'am. And Colleen's slave name would be K, like the letter K, inspired by the story of O, which is a French erotic novel that Cameron Hooker enjoyed. I will not be referring to Colleen as K. I will refer to her by her real name. Colleen was also made to wear a collar around her neck, which was a symbol of her slavery and how she was to be identified by the company as a slave. She was only allowed to speak when she was given permission to do so. She was required to kneel before Cameron. She was required to bow her head, and she was to ask permission before she was able to move or do anything. Colleen's collar ended up wearing out twice over time. So eventually Cameron gave Colleen a piercing with an earring through her right labia, which was the mark that she was a slave, that she would be identified by. If she escaped, they would look and see it, and she would be in a lot of trouble. Cameron Hooker had filled Colleen's head full of his lies to scare her. He was telling her about an entity that he referred to as the company. He told her that they were this powerful enforcer kind of an organization made up of an underground network of slave traders that was always watching her and watching her family. And if she ever tried to escape, there would be swift, harsh, and painful punishments in store for her, as well as those that she loved and cared for. The members of the company were supposedly watching sex slaves closely, looking for any sort of indication that they were going to try to escape. Cameron used this story that he made up about the company to threaten Colleen into not attempting to try to run away. He even used a time when Janice had some surgery on her knee in January of 1978 and came home with a brace on. He told Colleen that Janice had been tortured by the company because of an escape attempt, at which time they did permanent damage to her knees. And Janice went along with the things that Cameron was telling her, though the truth of the matter is that Janice never really was a slave. Janice would say, though, that she did have a deep fear of her husband and always did as she was told. At first, I kind of thought that Colleen signed the contract in order to placate Cameron, that she didn't really take it seriously, and that if she did have the opportunity to escape, if that ever presented itself, she would go for it and run. But then, as I continued into the story, I realized that Colleen really did seem to think that the contract was a very real and enforceable thing that she had to honor because she signed it. And once she did, Cameron's restrictions on her eased up a little bit. And over time, you'll see that Colleen was given more and more freedoms. Just a little, but still, it was better than what she had been having. What also began to change was Cameron started engaging in sexual activity with Colleen that he had promised Janice that he wouldn't do. It started with oral sex, but let's call it what it is. It was rape. Cameron Hooker was raping Colleen, so it was oral rape. Taking a page from former President Bill Clinton's playbook, or perhaps Bill Clinton was taking a page from Cameron's playbook. Either way, the oral sex did not constitute quote-unquote sexual relations in Cameron's head. He did not consider oral sex to be sex, so he did not consider it to be breaking his promise to Janice. But it is my understanding that Janice considered sex being any kind of penetration, so to her, this would have been a breach of their agreement. But anyway, Cameron claims that he did not engage in vaginal or anal sex with Colleen. However, he did use foreign objects to rape her repeatedly. Out of fear of the company, Colleen complied and obeyed. Now, I don't blame Colleen for believing everything that Cameron was telling her, but this is where I kind of started to feel that she was a little bit more gullible and naive than she may have even realized. If you remember in the beginning, I kind of said that Colleen saw herself as this worldly traveler and an expert at hitchhiking. I mean, of course, she could have never imagined anything like this. And we know better today, but maybe back then the thinking was different. And on top of that, Colleen was being kept under very terrifying and painful circumstances. She probably couldn't really tell anymore what was real and what wasn't, and Cameron Hooker knew that all too well. In order to sell the story even more, he told Colleen that Janice was a slave too, that she had attempted an escape and was caught, and to prevent the company from executing Janice, he married her, which caused the company to spare her life. Sometime after the contract was signed, the Hookers, along with Colleen, moved from the house that they had been living in to a mobile home. And this mobile home was located on a piece of property that Cameron Hooker had purchased. This place, of course, did not have a basement, so Cameron built some wooden boxes to fit underneath the waterbed that he and Janice slept on every night. And that became the new place that Colleen spent the majority of the day locked away in. Sometime in 1978, Janice had her second child with Cameron, and she gave birth to the baby on the waterbed as Colleen lay locked in the box underneath it all. As time wore on and Colleen was completely and totally obedient and compliant, because the more that she obeyed, and it wasn't that Cameron was disciplining her with physical punishments less than he had been, because that was part of what got him off, but she was given a little bit more freedoms. This eventually led Cameron to begin to trust Colleen with those freedoms. Little by little, Colleen was able to do more things. Cameron began to allow Colleen to go jogging, to do some gardening or yard work, and to do chores outside. She also helped take care of their 2 young children. And Cameron also had hopes to have several more slaves. So he and Colleen began working on constructing an underground prison or a dungeon where he could keep as many as he could fit down in there. I'll talk more about this thing that they were digging a little bit later on. Despite having these added freedoms, being able to jog around the neighborhood, to be let outside to do yard work, as well as chores around the house, she was doing housekeeping stuff, getting familiar with some of the neighbors, and having access to a phone. It was her fear of the company that kept Colleen from making any attempt to escape or ask anyone for help. The freedoms would be given to Colleen little by little as she earned Cameron's trust over the first couple of years that she was in captivity. And at any given moment, as soon as Cameron yelled the word attention, Colleen had to stop whatever she was doing, drop everything, take all of her clothes off, stand under this door jamb that was kind of an archway, and it was located inside the home. She had to raise her arms up above her head, put her hands on the archway, and stand there while Cameron took his whip and whipped her with it. Let's not forget that this is a win for Janice too, because she now doesn't have to do any housework. She doesn't have to do any work in the yard, and she doesn't have to be subjected to Cameron's abuse and torture. There eventually came a time when Janice, for some reason, decided perhaps she wanted to test her husband's loyalty. So she told him that if he really wanted to, he can go ahead and have sex with Colleen. Now, clearly Janice didn't want Cameron to have sex with Colleen, but Colleen thinks that Janice was testing him to see if he would really honor their agreement. But once Janice said, "Why don't you go ahead and have sex," before she could even finish her sentence, Cameron already had Colleen out of the box, stripped naked, tied her to the bed and was raping her. As Colleen was having to endure this, she listened to what Janice was doing, and she could hear that she was becoming physically ill, vomiting in the bathroom. But Cameron had no intentions of stopping. Once he raped Colleen, he began a pattern of sexually assaulting her about once a month. And I'm not clear as to why Janice offered him to have sex with Colleen, but once she did, he no longer felt that he needed to stick to that agreement that he had, and perhaps Janice was getting a little bit fed up with Cameron and his seemingly insatiable sexual appetite. And to me, this seemed like it marked the beginning of the end in terms of what Janice was willing to put up with anymore. Eventually, she's going to want everything to come to a full stop. But that's much later on down the line. So on the property on which they now lived, Cameron, also along with Colleen's help, began constructing what looked to me like sort of a trailer. It was kind of like a portable building, but Colleen called it a shed. And this was going to be taking the place of the basement that they no longer had. It was going to be where Cameron was going to keep Colleen captive as well as torture her by way of hanging her from the ceiling, using his whips on her. And he also built this torture device that when she was attached to it, her body would be stretched out. It's like a medieval style torture implement called a rack, which was Cameron's inspiration. I'm sure he was reading up on it in one of his bondage magazines. So yeah, he built one of these things in the shed in order to use to torture Colleen. So you can look at various versions of the rack if you Google it. It's typically rectangular in shape and raised off the ground. Sometimes it's at an angle and it has a roller either on one end or both ends. The person being tortured on the rack would have their wrists attached to one roller above their head and their ankles attached to the other down by their feet. The person who was doing the torturing, for whatever reasons, they might be asking questions or doing some sort of interrogation or trying to get information from someone, they slowly begin to use a ratchet type device to begin putting strain on the person attached to this thing, causing the ropes that are connected to the victim to become tighter and tighter, which in turn causes a tremendous amount of pain on the person's joints and limbs. Eventually, if there are no intentions of allowing the victim to survive this ordeal, the victim's limbs will become dislocated and eventually separated. All the while, those who are in close proximity to the victim while the torture is going on can very clearly hear all of the audible sounds coming from the victim's joints and bones and everything in between popping and snapping and breaking and coming apart. And the person doing the torturing is also free to apply additional methods of torture at the same time. Many cruel and painful and torturous things can happen to a person who is attached to this thing. So Cameron made one of these racks and he attached Colleen to it and stretched her as much as she could be stretched. And while it caused her a tremendous amount of pain, it doesn't seem he ever caused any of her joints to become dislocated, though I don't think she's ever mentioned whether or not how much damage was done to her because of this thing. But Colleen could never be sure how far Cameron was going to go. She would just have to lay on that thing and be in so much pain, and she was naked and she would just pray and pray, thinking that she was going to die right there on that rack. In addition to all of this, while Cameron had completed the construction of his shed where all of this abuse and torture of Colleen was taking place, he was out there with her more and more frequently than he had been previously because it was away from Janice and it was away from his kids. It gave him more space and more privacy, which he thoroughly enjoyed. But Janice, she didn't like it one bit. She knew things were escalating between Cameron and Colleen, but Colleen does not think that Janice was aware of how frequently Cameron was raping her. Janice knew about everything else, the whippings, the torture, the rack, and she stood by idly as it went on. But many believe that Janice too had been subjected to much of the same treatment before Colleen came along, and that she was just as much of a victim as Colleen was. While I do believe that Janice was subjected to torture and abuse at the hands of Cameron Hooker, I still don't think that she can be completely cleared of all culpability in what happened to Colleen. I understand that she may have been under duress, and she may have been acting out of fear. But from what I've seen and read about the dynamic between Janice and Cameron, she wasn't completely powerless to his whims and desires. She had some say, and we'll come to find out that she did in fact have the power and the wherewithal to end this whole thing for Colleen if she wanted to at any point in time. It did not have to go on for 7 years. Janice could have stopped this much sooner, but she chose not to, and the reasons for that, only she can say. It's a touchy place where to fit Janice into all this when it comes to who is responsible for the atrocities that were committed against Colleen. We've seen many a case where the wife or girlfriend stands by while their significant other is committing these types of crimes. Sometimes a woman goes along to please her man. Sometimes she does it out of fear. People do things that they might normally do when they are in love or think they're in love with someone, I guess. For Janice, she enjoyed the rewards because of Colleen's presence in their home. Colleen did all the housework, all the cooking and cleaning and picking up after the children. She took care of the kids. She babysat. And Janice was no longer subjected to Cameron's torture and whippings. Janice definitely benefited from Colleen being Cameron's slave. She was essentially a slave for both of them, just for different purposes. But Colleen could tell that Janice did not really like the idea of her being in the middle of their marriage. That bothered her. Janice was jealous of all the attention that Colleen was getting from Cameron. And Colleen seemed to think that Janice was unaware that she was being raped by Cameron, but I think there's a strong possibility that Janice was aware of it, and she was not happy about it. Sometime in 1979, so about 2 years into captivity, Cameron believed that he had Colleen completely convinced that they were being constantly watched by the company. He believed that Colleen understood that if she tried to run away, the company would find her and her family and torture and kill them all. And Colleen truly believed everything Cameron was telling her. She believed that she was being watched constantly and she lived in fear for her safety and the safety of her family. On the surface, it seems a little silly and naive to believe this kind of nonsense, but Cameron Hooker worked really hard to break Colleen down to a point where she took everything that he said as gospel. And from April of 1979 through January of 1980, Janice had a job working nights, so she would leave when Cameron came home from his job. And during this span of time, Cameron would let Colleen out of the box to make his dinner and wash all the dishes. However, in June of 1980, Janice got a new job, which was during the day. Colleen would take care of the children while they were at work, and this arrangement continued until February of 1981, when Janice stopped working because Cameron wanted to have Colleen back in the box. He began fearing that she was enjoying too many freedoms. He wanted to reestablish his dominance and control over her. But during those few months when the two of them were working during the day, Colleen very much enjoyed the freedom that she had when they were gone. She was free to do as she pleased. She never left or attempted to escape out of fear of the company. They were constantly surveilling her. They were able to track her wherever she went, and if they caught her, she'd be in a lot of trouble. Towards the end of 1980, Colleen had been captive for more than 2.5 years by then, and her family had not heard anything from her in all that time. She was still considered to be a missing person and her case was active, but that December, Cameron decided to allow Colleen to make a phone call to her family, which kind of took her by surprise. They went to a payphone, and Cameron made sure he gave Colleen a stern warning. He was going to be standing right there listening to every single word that she says. And if she so much as hints at anything that has been going on, or says anything that's going to give him away, or anything that he doesn't want her to say, he's going to hang up that call and she's going to pay for it dearly. Colleen's parents, of course, were so relieved to hear from her, but they could tell by her voice and her tone that there was something very wrong. But Colleen couldn't say much, and eventually Cameron did hang up the phone call before she was finished. So for now, Colleen's parents were excited and happy to have heard from her, to know that she was alive. But that was going to be it for the time being. As the months passed, Colleen continued to spend about 23 hours a day confined in the box under the bed. And every single time Janice was gone for whatever reason, Cameron took that opportunity to rape her. Every single time. But the upside was that Colleen was being given more freedoms as time went on, because Cameron and Janice knew that she lived in constant fear of the company and would not double-cross them, and they knew that Colleen would not break that contract that she signed. Then in the early spring of 1980, so about 4 years into Colleen's captivity, close to 4 years, Cameron had another surprise for Colleen. He told her that the company had given their permission and approval for Colleen to travel down to Riverside, California to visit her family. But there was one condition. She needed to prove her trustworthiness to Cameron. He forced Colleen down to her knees in front of him and handed her a gun. He demanded that she insert the barrel of the gun into her mouth and pull the trigger. She did so, and nothing happened. She had to obey Cameron's orders if she wanted to go see her family. According to the court documents, Colleen had asked Cameron on several occasions leading up to this to be allowed to visit her family. In February of 1981, Cameron told Janice that he was planning to take Colleen down to Riverside to visit her parents in the next month, which was March. Before they left, Cameron told Colleen that he needed to get permission from the company, and he would also be required to put up a $30,000 security deposit to cover the company's expenses to keep watch over her and her family during that trip. 1 week before they drove to Riverside, Cameron told Colleen to tell the children and the neighbors that she was leaving, but this wasn't true. He wanted the neighbors and his kids to believe that Colleen was gone for good. And he went so far as to pretend to drive Colleen to the bus station, but instead he smuggled Colleen back into their trailer and forced her into the box under the bed. And she stayed there until they were ready to leave. So they set off for Colleen's visit to her parents' house. Along the way, Cameron stopped someplace in Sacramento and told Colleen that that was the company's headquarters. He said that before they left for Riverside, the company needed to test her, and in the way that they were going to do that was to administer a lie detector test. Cameron went into some random building in Sacramento, and you know it's random because you know all of this is BS, and he was gone for a few minutes, and when he came back, he told Colleen that the company decided to go ahead and waive the lie detector test this time. On March 20th, 1981, Cameron drove with Colleen from Red Bluff to Riverside and brought her to see her parents. Along the way, he rehearsed with Colleen everything that he wanted her to say to make sure that they had their story straight and she didn't say anything that he didn't want her to say. The story is that she and Cameron were engaged and that he was headed to a work-related conference in San Diego, and he thought it would be a good idea for Colleen to come along so she could visit with her parents while he went to this conference. But he also reminded Colleen that her and her family were being watched 24 hours a day, 7 days a week by the company, and to not get any ideas or try to tip her family off about what was really going on, or else. So during this visit, Colleen remained pretty tight-lipped for the one day that she was allowed to see her family. Cameron had left, trusting that she would obey. Out of fear of the company, Colleen did exactly what she was told. She did not want her family to be harmed in any way. Less than a day later, Cameron called Colleen at her parents' house and told her that he was on his way to pick her up. He'd be there in just a few minutes. Colleen was completely devastated. I guess there was a part of her that hoped that he would never come back, or at the very least, she'd have more than a day to spend there. It was a deeply sinking feeling for her, and within a few minutes, Cameron arrived to pick her up so they could head back to Red Bluff. But before they left, Colleen's stepmom insisted that she wanted to snap at least one photo of the couple, which was shown in the documentary. I'll take a screenshot of the picture and post it on social media as soon as this episode goes live. It's a very haunting picture to see the two of them, Colleen and Cameron, embracing each other and smiling, as if they were indeed an engaged couple. Knowing the truth of what was actually going on, it is truly one of the most disturbing pictures I've seen. It is telling of just how desperate Colleen was to not only survive this, but to also protect her family. If you didn't know any better, you'd think these two young people were actually in love. Colleen would later explain that her big smile and embracing Cameron was an extension of her happiness to have been able to see her family on that day. And another thing before they left, Colleen's dad and stepmom, they wanted their contact information, address, phone number, everything, so that they could keep in touch. Remember, at this point, they had not seen Colleen in almost 4 years, and they had barely heard from her by phone. Now, Colleen only describes the one phone call that she was allowed to make. The court documents indicate that Colleen had made a couple of phone calls, maybe 2 or 3. But Cameron interjected. He reassured Colleen's parents that they would get that information to them, that they were in the process of moving, but as soon as they got settled, they'd forward all of the contact information to them. And of course, that never happened. When they got home from their trip to Riverside, Janice wasn't there, so Cameron raped Colleen again and locked her back inside the box under the waterbed. Based on their interactions with Colleen and what they had witnessed, her dad and stepmom thought it was likely that Colleen had joined a cult. She was wearing clothing that she made herself. She didn't have any money, and she wasn't calling or writing or reaching out to them for years at a time. But they chose to stay quiet too. They didn't ask too many questions out of fear that they'd push Colleen even further away, and they'd never get to see her again. So something changed when Colleen and Cameron got back to Red Bluff. The small freedoms that she had been given, the ones that she had quote-unquote earned as a result of being obedient, were all suddenly gone. As a matter of fact, for the next 3 years, Colleen was hardly let out of the box under the waterbed at all. Now remember, Cameron had set it all up for their children and their neighbors to think Colleen was leaving for good. So he had to keep her hidden. She was no longer allowed to go jogging or to go working in the garden. It was all taken away. Colleen thought that perhaps Cameron was afraid that he allowed her too much freedom by leaving her at her parents' house for that day, and as a consequence, she was back to being confined for 23 hours at a time until sometime in 1984. Now, Janice and Cameron's children had grown to know Colleen and had developed an attachment. He no longer allowed his children to see her. He told them that she moved out. But once they were asleep at night, he would take Colleen and remove her from the box. He'd give her some food and water and then torture her and rape her. Years went by with the Hooker children having no idea that Colleen was inside their home. And while she was in the box, she was forbidden from making any kind of sounds. She was required to lay completely still the entire time that she was in there, which probably helped Colleen survive due to the fact that there was very little air to breathe while she was in this box. During the summers, it was miserably sweltering. But Colleen, her body, somehow, she adapted. The human body is an amazing thing, even subjected to some of the worst conditions imaginable. Obviously, during the time Colleen was in captivity, Cameron Hooker committed numerous sexual assaults against her. To Colleen's best estimate, she was raped about once or twice a week throughout 1980 and 1981. Sometime in 1980, Colleen reported that she told Cameron that she loved him. This, of course, isn't true. These were not genuine feelings that she was expressing. And if you're like me, you probably threw up a little bit in your mouth when I said that. The reason she told Cameron this was because she thought he might treat her better if he believed her. She also told him on another occasion that she was grateful for the freedoms that he did allow her. But try as Colleen may have, it doesn't change the fact that Cameron Hooker was and is a sexual sadist. He gets off on her pain and suffering. He doesn't want or need her love or affection. He wants her to scream and writhe in pain so he can experience sexual gratification and get off on it. Sometime in 1982, Cameron admitted to his wife Janice that he was regularly having sexual intercourse with Colleen, raping her technically. When Janice heard this news, she was hurt and upset by it. So what he did was, in the later part of 1982, he began making Janice recite the Bible to him, page by page. And as she went along, he would point out any of the passages that discussed the requirement of wives and slaves to be submissive. Janice would later say that Cameron constantly told her that if she did not obey him as instructed by the Bible, that she would be going to hell. The following year, in 1983, Cameron told his wife that he was getting ready to obtain more slaves, and it was his goal to have at least 4. And he was going to keep them in the dungeon that he was constructing on the property. He continued to tell Janice how he was going to carry out this plan over the course of the next year, going into the summer of 1984. This, along with his continually engaging in sexual intercourse with Colleen, caused Janice to grow increasingly upset and distraught over his behavior and their marriage. There had been a period of time that Colleen guessed it was sometime in 1970 or 1980 that Cameron was having Colleen help him dig that large hole in the property that I was telling you about, while Janice stood by and supervised. This hole was also lined with concrete blocks. It would take about 2 years for this project of his to be completed. Well, towards the end of 1983, Cameron forced Colleen to get into this hole that she had helped him dig. Within a week, the weather had turned and it began to storm and rain, at which point this hole began to fill with water. And it would be Janice who took Colleen out of the hole and put her back into the box underneath their waterbed. 3 weeks later, Cameron took Colleen back out from under the bed and placed her back in the hole. Colleen remained in this hole in the ground for about a week when Cameron suddenly began to worry that one of his children had noticed her down in this hole. At that point, he placed Colleen back in the box under the bed. At the beginning of 1984, Colleen was given a few more freedoms again, finally. She was allowed out of the box at night and was able to sleep in the back bathroom of the house. She was still under the belief that the company were constantly surveilling her, so she continued to obey, living under that constant fear. By May, Colleen was able to talk Cameron into allowing her to get a job outside the home, which he did, and she ended up finding work as a housekeeper at the King's Lodge Hotel in Red Bluff, which was located just a few miles from their trailer. Sometimes Janice would be the one to drive Colleen to work, and sometimes she rode a bike. She turned her paychecks over to Cameron, and he would give her an allowance of $20 each pay period for her to have as spending money. By July, Cameron was becoming more bold with his sexual interactions with Colleen, as well as with Janice, eventually having both women with him while he would have sex with one or both of them. Essentially, he started having threesomes with the 2 women. He told Janice that this was the way it was going to be, that Colleen was his slave wife in a biblical sense, and Janice continued to go along, thinking that she was going to be doomed to hell if she didn't. By the end of July, Cameron made the proclamation that he would be having sex with the women on alternating nights. Janice on one night, Colleen on the next, and so on. So gross. Neither one of them had any desire to be a part of this arrangement, but both of them felt that they had no choice. Colleen because of her fear of the company, Janice because of her fear of hell. As you can imagine, all of this is starting to take its toll on Janice, mentally and emotionally. While I can't say for sure how much she is responsible or not for what's happening here with Colleen, she is married to the guy. She has children with him. And I guess she loves him. She can't possibly feel good about having another woman in the periphery of their marriage. And it would also be in this month of July that Cameron decided to make these changes to the dynamics of his relationship with Colleen and Janice that they both began going to church. Janice began confiding in the pastor about the living situation and what they'd been doing for the past 7 years. The pastor strongly advised Janice that she needed to allow Colleen to go home, she needed to get herself and her children away from this man, and she needed to contact law enforcement and have him taken into custody immediately for his crimes. By August of 1984, now this is more than 7 years since the day Cameron and Janice Hooker picked up Colleen as she was hitchhiking a few miles away from their home in Red Bluff, Janice was beginning to unravel. She described herself as being on the verge of a full-blown nervous breakdown. What Cameron had not realized was that he could only push Janice so far before she was going to fall apart. In the beginning, they had a deal, but as time went on, he was becoming more and more bold, pushing past Janice's limits and boundaries, because it was never going to be enough. It was never enough for Cameron Hooker. Janice finally came to realize that no matter how much she gave in to him, Cameron Hooker was always going to want more. So on August 9th, 1984, Janice drove Colleen to her job and dropped her off. From there, she headed to the church that she and Colleen had been attending services at and stopped in to talk to the pastor again. He again advised her that they both needed to get out of that situation as soon as possible. It was unhealthy, it was harmful, it was dangerous, and Janice needed to stand up for herself and for Colleen. She needed to do the right thing. Leave this man and allow Colleen to return home to her family. Finally, Janice was listening to someone other than Cameron Hooker and decided to follow her pastor's advice. She left the church and drove back to Colleen's hotel. She found her and told her that she needed to tell her something. And this would be the first time that Colleen heard that the company did not exist. When Colleen heard this, she too nearly had a breakdown. Hearing those words come from Janice was absolutely devastating. She couldn't believe that all of this was a lie, because Cameron was so convincing. She had truly believed all those years that she was in danger and that her family was in danger, and come to find that none of it was true. From there, Janice and Colleen went back to the church together to speak to the pastor once more before the two women went home for the night. Janice did not tell Cameron that she had confessed the company was made up to Colleen because she was afraid that he would kill the both of them. But I think he would have either manipulated Janice again or he would have just kept them both captive. I don't think he would have killed them. Although I wouldn't put it past him, I believe he really wanted them alive so he can do the things that he liked to do. So together, Janice and Colleen planned to make their escape the following morning, August 10th, 1984. That morning, Cameron got up and left for work. As soon as he was gone, Janice and Colleen packed up their things along with the kids and went to Janice's parents' house. From there, Colleen was able to call her parents and ask them to wire her money to purchase a bus ticket. The following day, on August 11th, just before she boarded that bus, Colleen found a payphone and called Cameron Hooker. She told him that she was leaving, that she knew the company wasn't real, and that there wasn't a damn thing that he could do to force her to stay with him any longer. The following morning, on August 12th, 1984, Colleen Stan was finally reunited with her family in Riverside. From there, she began to open up and explain why she had been gone for 7 long years. As for Janice, she ended up going back to the mobile home after about a week. I can only assume that Cameron was begging her to come back, making promises that he would seek help, so she agreed to come. He began going to church with Janice, and she also insisted that he seek counseling. Janice insisted that they also destroy the bondage contraptions that he had built, which he did, and the things that he did not destroy, Janice tried to hide from him. She was afraid that now that Colleen was gone, that he was going to force her to be his slave again and begin torturing her as he had in the beginning of their relationship, especially since he knew that she was responsible for letting Colleen go. But Janice continued to suffer from severe anxiety attacks. Just being in that trailer home brought on the attacks. She couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep. So finally, she went back to her parents' house at the end of September of 1984. And as soon as she did, her anxiety attacks completely stopped. All she needed to do was get away from that trailer and get away from Cameron Hooker. Over the course of the next several months, Colleen continued to communicate with both Janice and Cameron, either by phone or by mail. Janice was asking Colleen to please not go to the police because she wanted Cameron to have a chance to try and fix himself, to straighten up and to seek professional help. Surprisingly, Colleen agreed to not go to police, but the couple still worried that she would. Colleen's family, however, applied a tremendous amount of pressure on her to turn them both in for what they'd put her through. But at the beginning, Colleen was just so grateful to be free and to be home that she really wanted to move on and leave the entire 7-year, 2-month, and 22-day ordeal behind. On November 1st, 1984, Janice stopped by the trailer to see if Cameron had destroyed what was left of all of his bondage contraptions, but she had found that he had not. About a week later, a friend of Janice's with whom she had confided all that had happened over the course of those 7 years began to express concern that Cameron may hurt Janice or her children. Now this instilled a great deal of fear into Janice. So later that same day, she went back to the church. She spoke to the pastor again, and it would be the pastor who finally called law enforcement to report what Cameron Hooker had done. He felt comfortable doing so because he knew that both of the women and the children were no longer in the home with this man. Cameron Hooker was taken into custody and faced a slew of charges: kidnapping with the use of a deadly weapon, 3 counts of false imprisonment, 7 counts of forcible rape, 2 counts of abduction for illicit relations, and single counts for false imprisonment, forcible oral copulation, and penetration with a foreign object. Cameron pleaded not guilty to all the charges. Before the trial started, Cameron's attorney wanted to introduce evidence regarding Colleen's prior sexual content before the kidnapping. Of course he did. Blaming the victim, assassinating her character. Yeah. It's safe to assume that the defense was going to try to portray Colleen as a sexually promiscuous woman who was with Cameron voluntarily, that nothing was forced on her. Fortunately, the judge ruled that Colleen's past would be inadmissible. Janice was offered full immunity for her testimony, which she provided. When she testified, she was very emotional and oftentimes had some intense outbursts while on the stand. While in contrast, Colleen, who stood up and testified against her kidnapper and rapist, was very measured and lacked emotion. And if you've watched the various interviews that she's given over the years, she is basically the same. Very monotone and unemotional, to a point that it really stood out to me how much she lacked in the way of any emotion related to what had been done to her. I can't say how or why Colleen is able to remain so calm because I'm not an expert on human behavior, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's kind of like something that she talks about as if it happened to another person. Like this was so horrific, it could not have possibly been a real thing that actually happened to her in her life. Kind of sort of like compartmentalizing the whole thing, distancing herself like it was a bad dream. Maybe it's a coping mechanism of sorts. I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. I don't know. Evidence was presented in the case, including testimony from neighbors, the Hooker children, Colleen's sister, and the pastor, whom the women confided in. Physical evidence included the head box, pictures that Cameron had taken and kept of Colleen in bondage, the waterbed pedestal with the box concealed underneath it, the rack that Colleen had been stretched out on, and the contract that Colleen had signed all those years earlier. Experts testified on behalf of the prosecution as to how and why Colleen reacted the way that she did to the way that Cameron Hooker was treating her. There were a number of factors that the experts pointed to that they believed that Colleen had been coerced into staying with him and obeying him, and it mainly had to do with his conduct, his kidnapping of her, isolating her, keeping her naked, abusing her, keeping her from seeing the light of day, controlling what and how much she ate and drank, controlling when she could go to the bathroom, making Colleen completely dependent on him, forcing her to ask permission for everything that she wanted, threatening her family, threatening to sell her to another slave owner where she would probably be treated worse, torturing her, forcing her to sign the contract, and forcing a new life pattern onto Colleen. All of it was effective in keeping her from resisting Cameron, keeping her in captivity. Cameron Hooker had the nerve to testify on his own behalf, at which time he admitted, "Yeah, I kidnapped her and I kept her in that box and I did some bondage, but Colleen consented to all of the sex acts." And he also said that there were times when she was free to go, but she stayed because she was in love with him, he said, and told him that she was. Oh my God, this guy. So gross. He admitted that he lied to Colleen about the company, but he said that he told her that he had bought her contract out with them, so she should have known that they were no longer watching her. And he did eventually admit that Colleen didn't know that he was not a part of the company for the entire 7 years that she was being held captive. The defense called an expert of their own who suggested that Colleen wasn't stupid enough to actually believe in the existence of the company of slave traders, and that she really stayed with Cameron because she was in love with him and wanted to help parent his children. And to prove this, the defense presented letters that Colleen had sent to Cameron, as well as phone records showing that she continued to speak with him frequently after her release. And the jury was like, "Yeah, no, you're guilty of everything as charged with the exception of one count of rape," and that resulted in a hung jury. But Cameron was eventually sentenced to various lengths of time for the various convictions, all of which were going to be served consecutively, not concurrently, and it all added up to 104 years. So Cameron Hooker, you can just go away. However, this guy became eligible for parole in 2015, which he was not only denied, but he was also not going to be given the chance to be up for parole again until 2030. However, a couple of days ago, an article came out that suggested that he could be out of prison as early as 2021 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, this man is only 66 years old, and many believe he could still pose a very real danger to society, and I tend to agree. To me, considering his crimes and all that he did to Colleen over a sustained period of 7 years, he really should not be eligible for early release because of this pandemic. I'm sure there are lots of other inmates who deserve a second chance aside from this guy. So let's keep a close eye on this case over the next few months and see what happens, because I'm hoping that he doesn't get out. Colleen's post-captivity life has not been an easy one. She did eventually earn a degree in accounting. She tried to live as normal of a life as possible, but ended up getting into several marriages. All of them failed. And she had one daughter who is unfortunately currently in prison herself. Her name is Danielle Rodriguez. In 2013, she had been released after serving 10 years for her involvement in the 2003 murder of a 40-year-old woman named Sandra Metz, which at the time Danielle was only 17 when it happened. She got in trouble for some parole violations, including possession of methamphetamines. She faced trial for those charges and ended up being sentenced to 7 years in prison. And today, Colleen's daughter, who is 40 years old, is currently in jail. As for Janice, she took back her maiden name, Lashley, and she is now a registered social worker and a mental health professional. I looked her up. She is on healthgrades.com as Janice Lashley, certified social worker in Paradise, California. Colleen has also changed her name. They both still live in California, and Janice and Colleen have no communication with one another. As for Marie Elizabeth Spanek, no charges have ever been brought. Her body hasn't been found. Too much time has passed. They decided to not press charges on Cameron Hooker for her disappearance and presumed murder. The one thing that stood out when I watched the documentaries on this case is that Colleen speaks so matter-of-factly about her ordeal. It's really hard to get a read on how exactly this whole thing really affected her. She went through an experience that nightmares are made of, something so terrifying. It's hard to imagine what every moment of those 7 years was like for her, but she survived it. And she's had the courage to openly discuss her experiences with us, which I find to be astounding. She's, to me, a very strong woman. And the one thing I continue to hope for is that she's able to somehow, some way, rediscover the innocence and simplicity that was her life before the day that man tried to destroy it. I hope she does. I know her life has been rough, and I know it hasn't been easy. Because everybody deserves to have that peaceful, happy place in this chaotic world. And that will bring this 155th episode of California Dreaming to a close. Come over to our Facebook discussion group. I really want to know your opinions on Janice Lachey, formerly Janice Hooker, and what you think about her role in all of this and if she truly got what she deserved. Come to the Facebook page, come to Twitter, come to Instagram. Tell me your opinions, not only about our shows, but also other podcasts that you listen to. Recommend your documentaries, books that you've read, as well as post about current news stories, post about your pets, post about your vacations. Post also, somebody asked me about this, if you are a creator, if you have a podcast or a blog or a YouTube channel, or you're an author and you write books. While I do prefer it to be true crime related, it doesn't necessarily have to. If you want to share your creations or your websites, feel free to post it in the group. I'm not one of those that's going to take your post down and tell you can't tell us about your stuff, because you're there for me to tell you about all my stuff. So please come and tell us what you do. Share your things, your websites, your channels, your social medias, everything. You're all welcome. I'm never one to shut anybody out of this. So come over and share. I want to see it all. You can also please go over to our Facebook page, and if you would like me to go to your Facebook page and leave you a review, let me know. You can like my page, leave a review or a recommendation. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram. The handles are at California Pod and at California Dreaming Pod, respectively. California Dreaming is brought to you by the Orbital Jigsaw Network, a podcast production company on a mission to create some of the best podcasts to listen to, with an amazing roster of shows, with content including true crime, history, sports, entertainment, gaming, and social media. So please visit our website at www.orbitaljigsaw.com. You'll find links to all of our podcasts, as well as a direct link to our merchandise store. And you guys, I love the face masks that you guys ordered. I keep forgetting to order mine, but I'll get around to it eventually. Again, that website is www.orbitaljigsaw.com. Thank you again so much for listening. I will see you all in the discussion group on Instagram and on Twitter. I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams.